The former head of the CDC says, hey, I actually think SARS-CoV-2 came from a lab.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wild.
Robert Redfield, former CDC director, in this video interview with CNN. We were going to have Zach show a couple minutes of this for people who aren't already aware of it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we can't hear it while it's showing, so we have to remember what's in this. So Zach, you want to show the first 2.0 through 2.05, and then we'll say something, and then we'll jump to the next little section.
Former director of the CDC is speaking out on when and where he thinks the coronavirus pandemic originated. Here is Dr. Robert Redfield when he sat down with Sanjay Gupta.
If I was to guess, this virus started transmitting somewhere in September, October in Wuhan.
September, October.
That's my own view. It's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions. Now, I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
It is also not unusual for that type of research to be occurring in Wuhan. The city is a widely known center for viral studies in China, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has experimented extensively with bat coronaviruses.
It is a remarkable conversation I feel like we're having here, because you are the former CDC director and you were the director at the time this was all happening.
For the first time, the former CDC director is stating publicly that he believes this pandemic started months earlier than we knew, and that it originated not at a wet market, but inside a lab in China.
These are two significant things to say, Dr. Redfield.
That's not implying any intentionality. It's my opinion, right? But I am a virologist. I have spent my life in virology. I do not believe this somehow came from a bat to a human, and at that moment in time, the virus that came to the human became one of the most infectious viruses that we know in humanity for human-to-human transmission. Normally when a pathogen goes from a zoonotic to human, it takes a while for it to figure out how to become more and more efficient in human-to-human transmission. I just don't think this makes biological sense.
So in the lab, do you think that process of becoming more efficient was happening? Is that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, let's just say I have coronavirus that I'm working on. Most of us in the lab.
All right.
So for those who were just listening, on screen throughout most of that interview with former CDC Director Redfield, it says CNN has written, former CDC Director says he thinks COVID-19 originated in a Chinese lab but has no evidence.
Yeah, I hear this claim a lot. There's no evidence for this hypothesis. Well, of course, everybody says theory, which they shouldn't. But there's no evidence, which is preposterous. There's a tremendous amount of evidence. What I would say is there is no evidence of a natural origin. There is evidence. It is not direct evidence of a laboratory origin. And so that is striking. And the idea, I'm troubled by the journalism that surrounds this. In this case, I think this CNN report effectively doesn't go anywhere new. The only news here is that somebody who was in a position to know what was being said on the inside has come to this conclusion.
Right. And we'll link to the whole this whole little piece in the show notes. But you then have the interviewer being somewhat dismayed with the CNN people, whereas he does not appear dismayed here with Redfield. And maybe now, before we say anything more, we should jump to the next little bit of this, Zach, starting at 340, that we wanted to show, where we have to 418. Yep.
Expressing is that there certainly are possibilities, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, of how a virus adapts itself to a efficient spread among humans. One of them is in the lab, and one of them, which is the more likely, which most public health officials agree with, is that it likely was below the radar screen, spreading in the community in China for several weeks, if not a month or more, which allowed it, when it first got recognized clinically, to be pretty well adapted.
So
So that was Fauci, for those who were only listening rather than watching. And it doesn't look like science. It looks like politics.
Yeah, this is clearly politics. And
But it's veiled as science. It's veiled as this, the foremost authority that we are supposed to be listening to scientifically on this topic. And being back on his heels doesn't feel good, and so it's sort of more clearly a political response.
so I would say, I think it goes one step beyond that. That in essence, what we are now watching is many mainstream publications and broadcasts that have taken up a very clear position, under the false banner, follow the science, scientific consensus, whatever it is that's being deployed.
Right.
They have got themselves in a bind, because one would expect that if this indeed were of natural origin, evidence for that would emerge, and evidence that was inconsistent with the laboratory origin would also emerge, and they would find themselves relieved to have taken up that position. Instead, what we're seeing is the opposite, and they are now figuring out how to live in a new world where this hypothesis that they did not want to survive has become unstoppable by virtue of how well it matches the evidence in question. So I think what you're watching is a sort of jockeying for position. So Fox News, for example, has done some actually quite credible reporting on this topic, and CNN has been on the wrong side of it. That's not to say that we know what happened, but it is to say that dismissing the idea of a lab leak has never been reasonable. And
any journalistic outfit that has said there is only one possible explanation for the origin of this virus at any point up until now is not doing good journalism.
Right. They're doing something else. And so the question is, what are they doing? Is it a business thing, right? Is it are they carrying water for somebody with an interest in where the science goes? And so, of course, if you're not really paying attention to the lab leak question, if you have been going along with the New York Times and CNN and these other publications, and now suddenly this shows up on CNN, it seems like news. Oh, this former head of CDC is taking this hypothesis seriously. Of course, what he says in that clip isn't anything that hasn't been discussed here. We discussed it on MAR. It has been widely discussed on Twitter. It has been discussed in the Wall Street Journal. Matt Ridley has covered it. So the point is, there's nothing new here. All he's saying is that he's convinced, and that is interesting, because it means that then nothing was said behind the scenes that actually tells us this lab leak did not happen.
But that is new, right? This is new, because this is someone with both the background to understand what is potentially going on, and someone who had access to potentially more information than any of the rest of us have. No, he is not laying out all the reasons that he thinks this in this very brief interview clip. We don't know all of what he thinks or why he thinks it. The idea that he has no evidence is not true. What we know is that he has not presented the evidence here in this interview, in this little tiny interview. That's all.
Well, what he says is the pattern of emergence, that this virus showing up and being very good at transmitting between people immediately with no evidence of it having learned that trick either in people or in an intermediate host is the evidence. And the point is that isn't new.
Yep.
I have, of course, seen lots of people say, well, this is a discredited CDC head on the basis of having botched the initial reaction to COVID, which is obviously irrelevant. This is not an accurate challenge. And then we have, on the other side, we have Fauci, who is also highly placed, arguably more expert in viruses and the challenges of pandemics. However, what they don't say here, as far as I know, is that Fauci is compromised, having been in the chain of influence that resulted in the gain-of-function research taking place in spite of very serious objections.
Pre-COVID. Years ago.
Right, years ago. But the point is, okay, if Fauci called it wrong, thought gain-of-function research was a great idea, and in fact, I think if you look at his reasoning, assuming that his reasoning is what he said publicly, he wanted to have a very rapid pathway to generating vaccines so that a pandemic couldn't get ahead of you. Right? That's a noble and that's a good idea. On the other hand, if that led him to advance gain-of-function research, which resulted in a lab leak, which then, crashed the world economy and killed millions of people, then that's a major error, and covering his ass is not valid. We need to know what happened. So there's a lot of levels of what's going on here, but at some level, what you're watching is the mainstream trying to figure out how to pivot to what those of us who have been paying attention to the evidence itself have recognized was a very viable hypothesis, and much more viable than the traditional explanation. We've known that for, since March of last year. So anyway, interesting to watch the big players pivot, but it's also frustrating because the big players are, in some sense, suddenly people are now going to feel licensed to think about this as a possibility, as if it just dawned on the scientific community that it is one, and that's not the case.
I'm not plagued by that. I mean, that will always be how things are. You don't. If a hypothesis is being subverted or not taken seriously for any reason, those few people who insist on talking about it are not going to be recognized by everyone as talking about the important thing until something else happens.
But that's my concern.
The fact is
Even
that there is
happen.
I don't know if there is a paper trail. There are several papers.
Yep.
And there's also now like a pixel trail. It's like a video trail. There are many of us, even who haven't written papers on this, who have been talking about this. So, the fact that this may be the thing, like, I'm grateful. I was hoping that, was it Ridley's article in the New York Post Intelligencer in December of last year? Was that Ridley? I can't remember.
Oh, no. You're talking about, why am I blanking on his name?
Oh, Nicholas Baker? Nicholson Baker.
Yeah.
I was hoping that might be the thing that actually broke this loose. That there have been a number of these, like, it's getting out. There have been a couple of Wall Street Journal op-eds, as you say, and any one of them that manages to get the monolithic media representation of anyone who talks about this as a right-wing conspiracy theorist, I'm in favor of.
Well, of course, but I'm deeply troubled by the pattern here. If history is any guide, those who talked about this early will not be vindicated by the system, right? The pretense will be, they were cranks. And then it just happened that that science discovered this thing. Isn't it nifty that we've discovered it, rather than actually they weren't cranks and you portrayed them as that falsely. So I'm troubled. I'm also troubled that the pattern is a narrative pattern. Right? In other words, the truth here is what people are convinced they need to discuss, rather than what the evidence says. And the problem is that the evidence, as I keep saying, the evidence is not conclusive, and there's no direct evidence of a lab leak. There is lots of evidence that points to a lab leak. That should have resulted in absolutely everybody who is capable of interpreting that evidence saying, regretfully, this is a possibility that needs not, what they've effectively said is, sure, formally, we need to leave that on the list, but it's very, very unlikely, rather than it is deeply troubling how likely that is and how all of the evidence remains consistent with that hypothesis. So I would much rather see the spectrum of what we discuss move naturally with the evidence, and that put us in whatever awkward position it puts us in, because we've lost a tremendous amount of time here fighting a narrative battle over whether responsible people think this way. And even in this set of clips, what Fauci says is nonsense.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt that he's smart enough to know that what he is saying is nonsense. But his point is, the solution to the problem that Redfield is pointing out right? A problem that I think Redfield is just reading into what the rest of us have been saying. There's something very anomalous about this highly effective virus reaching Wuhan and already being ready to go, right?
In humans.
Right. And what Fauci says is, oh, that logically is not a terrible problem because, in fact, it was probably circulating much earlier. And so the period of time in which it's bumbling along is just one you haven't discovered yet. But that is inconsistent with the evidence that we have about the phylogeny of this thing, where we appear to have effectively a point source, right? So somehow the discussion is moving too slowly, and this is progress in one regard, but it's maddening if you've been following the actual evidence.
It is moving too slowly. I agree with you about that. I think I disagree with you, or at least I'm going to push back against your framing of the problem is that it's narrative. Both because I believe that we can win with narrative rather than continuing to lose with narrative. Like I do think that's possible, and I'm a fan of narrative, as you are too. But I think I think it is sort of embedded even more deeply in how I go about viewing the world. But I also think, and maybe it's just because of that bias that I understand about myself, I think it is innate to what humans are and how we do things, and arguing for a non-narrative approach to this sort of thing will not work, because some people will always be using narrative, and if their narrative is at all compelling, as somehow apparently this, if you're talking lab leak or conspiracy theorist narrative, has been compelling to many, many, many people, then those people using narrative will beat out those people who don't. And I feel like this is a very analogous argument to having religion is a more adaptive position than not having.
Okay, but I am not arguing against the importance of narrative. What I'm arguing is that it is necessary in a scientific milieu that the narrative follows from, and I don't want to say the evidence itself, because the evidence itself doesn't speak to a narrative, but the hypothetico-deductive method in light of the evidence does point to various possible explanations.
Yes.
And the journalists, I mean, I don't even understand how this is possible. We are overproducing PhDs at an incredible rate because of things we don't need to talk about. But the university produces PhDs to get its work done cheaply because graduate students are cheap labor. So we produce a huge number of people who are never going to get a job in the fields in which they train. That means
including in legit fields, including in scientific fields.
Right, exactly. And I mean, it's especially true in scientific fields because the work is expensive. You need people who actually understand the science to teach the undergraduates. And so
asterisk, I would say it's especially true in fields that don't have any business existing at all. I would say all of those PhDs are overproduced.
Yes, but from the point of view of the university needing the labor and then conspiring to get it by pretending that there are more jobs than there are, inducing people to work for less than a living wage in pursuit of a degree, we produce all of these experts, right? Those people should, many of them, end up in journalism. And frankly, the things that get said in journalistic outlets are just completely unforgivable in light of how much spare expertise there is produced by the system. There's no way that this narrative needs to be driving this story, because you could have people who are, educated enough to get it, tracking this and saying, hey, boss, I hate to tell you this, but the lab leak hypothesis is absolutely viable. Yeah.
I guess I feel like there may be a piece missing in the story you just told. And maybe maybe the overproduction of PhDs is really of people who really are skillful and creative, like original thinkers who are able to also assess a whole bunch of technical information. What we have seen is that a tremendous number, and I think it's a tremendous majority of PhD programs, at least that we have had access to, do not involve people actually even doing their own research from beginning to end.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So, if you've got a whole bunch of people ending up with PhDs in sciences who walk into someone else's lab with someone else's grants, who already have a research program, and you say, okay, well, you're going to do this part. And yeah, they maybe figure out experimental design, and maybe they figure out how to do the analysis or whatever, but it's actually somewhat rare for in some departments, and I don't know how widespread that is, but I think it's pretty widespread for people who end up with PhDs to actually have even done a complete piece of their own research. And that's terrible, But that does mean, if that's true, that you may have a whole lot of people with PhDs who wouldn't actually be able to go do journalism because they wouldn't necessarily be able to see what is true. But I think what it would do, implied in what you said, is that it would free them from the perverse incentives that being in a situation where peer review depends on your peers respecting you and you not having overturned the status quo by saying, actually, I think that was a lab leak. Like, outside of academia, there are some perverse incentives that are hidden to most people. And in journalism, I'm sure there are too, but they're going to be different ones.
I think that's well said. And this actually, I don't have it queued up here, but what the president said in response to this is indicative of exactly the problem you're pointing to. The president basically said,
you're talking about Biden, you're talking about now.
Yeah. He said something, words to the effect of, he of course misused the word theory, something like, I have my own theories as to what happened, but I'm going to wait until the scientific community resolves this, which is like understandable, but wrong 6 different ways, right? That's not how science works. The scientific community is perfectly capable of being entirely wrong, right? The science itself points to an answer, and the scientific community can get it wrong. And the point you're making, which I fully agree with, is that the perverse incentives inside of the system make that all too likely. Mm-hmm. So if what Biden means by this is let's wait and see what mainstream virology thinks about this, mainstream virology has now 2 big problems. One, it allowed work to go on that whether or not it did create this pandemic could have created this pandemic.
Yep.
And then 2, it doubled down, and doubled down isn't even right. It did it 100 times. It told us this is not viable. The evidence does not support lab leak. Right. And it kept telling us that. And so the point is now, in order to not have to explain why it told us something wasn't possible that clearly is, it's just continuing to cover. So you can't say that science is a process. It's awesome. You should follow it. Yeah, I agree with that much. Right. And then it's like, well, how do we know what the process said? Oh, ask the experts in it. They all have the same conflict of interest. God damn it. Right. Wouldn't it be great if a bunch of people who were trained by this system then left the conflict of interest zone and were in a position to comment on it? Right? Yeah. That would be really useful. And yet instead what we get is journalism that if you understand the basics of what's being described, you're just constantly like, did I read what this is insane how low level the errors are.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, you've just described the, like, wouldn't it be great if people who know stuff were able to leave the zone with the conflict of interest? And, in some ways, this is what we have done.
Yep.
But we are also not virologists, not vaccinologists, not public health experts, not epidemiologists. But the uber generalist framing of evolutionary theory, which you can apply to everything outside of like rocks and quarks, allows a person to walk in if they have a bit of background and are able to look at facts dispassionately and have the humility and demand of themselves that they come back and say when they're wrong that they were wrong. You can walk into any number of complex systems and say, okay, nope, not my expertise, haven't published here, but let's see what this means. What's the evolutionary, what can we predict about what's going to happen evolutionarily based on what information we do know? And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to be increasingly clear about this. We are not epidemiologists. We are not even molecular biologists. But I don't think evolution is somehow secondary in this story at all.
Well, and as you have already pointed out, it's exactly the thing that Redfield names.
Oh, it's what both of them are talking about.
Well, because Fauci is responding to Redfield.
Yep.
But they are exactly talking about, basically Redfield saying, which I believe you said on Mar, and we have both said here on DarkHorse many times, a virus that has just made the jump from another species to humans would take some time to figure out how to go human to human very fast.
Yep.
And this is that's it in a nutshell. And there was apparently no time.
Right. And so there are explanations that could fit. Fauci has landed on one that doesn't, right? So the point is, interesting now that at least the English-speaking world is now juggling something central to the COVID story. And what does it hinge on? Wouldn't you know it? It hinges on a question of evolutionary dynamics, right?
Right.
And of course, this has been true all along. The fundamental questions here are not more molecular than they are evolutionary. They are both molecular and evolutionary and epidemiological, right? That's the nature of these stories. And so the question is, what's your road in? And if the idea is the virologists are going to pull rank on the evolutionary biologists, well, on what basis are you doing that other than power? Right?
Yeah.
That's not science.
Stay in my lane. The highway is evolutionary.
Right. Yeah, they're very well said. The highway is entirely evolutionary, whether it's understood to be or not.